They invented the brown beer bottle. They were literally the biggest brewery in the world. They shipped beer to Admiral Dewey's men after the Battle of Manila. They even figured out how to put sunshine, actual vitamin D, into their beer. And then they put snot in it. No, I'm not exaggerating. Customers opened bottles of Schlitz in 1976 and found what looked like mucus floating in their beer. Tiny white flakes. Some batches were so bad that drinkers described the stuff as looking like they'd blown their nose into the bottle. This is the story of Schlitz, the beer that made Milwaukee famous, and how a company that once towered over Budweiser managed to commit the most spectacular brand suicide in American business history. And the craziest part? Every single wound was self-inflicted. If you enjoy these deep dives into business disasters, hitting like is the best way to tell me to make more of them. It helps me know what you want to see. Let me show you how it happened. To understand Schlitz, you have to understand Milwaukee. And to understand Milwaukee, you have to go back to 1848. That year, revolutions swept across Europe. In the German states, liberals and nationalists rose up against the old monarchies and got crushed. Thousands fled. We call them the 48ers, and a huge number of them ended up in the American Midwest, particularly in a small but growing city on Lake Michigan. They brought their language, they brought their culture, and they brought their beer. By 1849, a 34-year-old Bavarian immigrant named August Krug had opened a small restaurant with a brewery attached on Chestnut Street in Milwaukee. It wasn't much, maybe 250 barrels a year, but it was a start. In 1850, Krug hired a bookkeeper, a young man named Joseph Schlitz, freshly arrived from Mainz, Germany. Schlitz was good with numbers. He was organized. And he was about to get very, very lucky. In 1856, August Krug died. He was only 41, killed by a fall. And just like that, the bookkeeper was running the brewery. 2 years later, Joseph Schlitz married Krug's widow, Anna Maria. He changed the name of the brewery to the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company. And here's the thing I want you to notice. This is a pattern we're going to see again and again in this story. The wrong death at the wrong time. And everything changes. Now, the Schlitz brewery was growing. By 1867, they were the fourth largest brewery in Milwaukee, cranking out almost 6,000 barrels a year. But they were still regional, still small time compared to what was coming. Then, on October 8th, 1871, Chicago caught fire. The Great Chicago Fire killed hundreds, left 100,000 homeless, and burned through the heart of the second largest city in America. It also destroyed most of Chicago's breweries. Schlitz already had a depot in Chicago. They'd set one up 3 years earlier. And when the fire hit, they moved fast. Whether it was charity or opportunism is still debated by historians. The donation story, Schlitz riding in like heroes to quench the thirst of a burning city, that might be marketing myth. What we know for certain is that sales doubled in the aftermath, and Schlitz now had a foothold in the most important beer market in the Midwest. Just 4 years later, Joseph Schlitz was dead. He'd boarded the SS Schiller, bound for Germany, and on May 7th, 1875, the ship struck rocks near the Isles of Scilly off the coast of Cornwall. 335 people died, including Joseph Schlitz. His body was never recovered. His widow Anna Maria offered a $25,000 reward. Nothing. But here's where the Eulein brothers enter the picture. August Eulein had been working at the brewery since he was 16 years old. He was Krug's nephew, and when Schlitz died, August and his three brothers, Henry, Alfred, and Edward, took over. They kept the Schlitz name because, quite simply, Americans couldn't pronounce Eulein. This family would control the brewery for over 100 years, and they would build it into the biggest beer company on the planet. The Euleins weren't just good businessmen, they were innovators. In 1883, William Eulein brought back the first pure culture yeast strain from Copenhagen. This was cutting-edge science at the time. It meant more consistent beer, fewer bad batches. In 1892, they introduced the iconic belted globe logo that would become synonymous with the brand. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, they unveiled the slogan that would define them for the next century, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. They were also brilliant at publicity stunts. In 1898, they sent publicized beer shipments to Admiral Dewey's men after the victory at Manila Bay. They shipped beer to Theodore Roosevelt's hunting party in Africa. Every time America celebrated something, Schlitz made sure their beer was part of the story. And then came the brown bottle. If you drink beer today, you probably never think about this, but before 1911, most beer was sold in clear glass bottles. The problem? Sunlight. UV light reacts with compounds in hops and creates something called skunky flavor, that distinctive off-taste you get from a Corona that's been sitting in a sunny window. Schlitz figured this out. In 1911 and 1912, they pioneered the use of brown glass bottles to protect their beer from sunlight. The entire industry quickly adopted this innovation. It's one of those things that seems obvious in hindsight, but someone had to do it first. And here's where the sunshine metaphor gets interesting. Because in 1936, Schlitz took their obsession with light in a completely different direction. They introduced Sunshine Vitamin D beer. Dr. Harry Steenbach at the University of Wisconsin had developed a process for adding vitamin D to food using ultraviolet light. Schlitz licensed the technology and literally shined UV light on their beer. Their marketing slogan? Beer is good for you, but Schlitz with Sunshine Vitamin D is extra good for you. This was the 1930s, the era of patent medicines and health tonics, and Schlitz was out there selling beer as a vitamin supplement. They only did this from 1936 to 1938, and it seems ridiculous now, but think about what it represents. A company confident enough in its product to experiment, to try crazy things, to bottle actual sunshine. Remember that image, we're going to need it later. Prohibition hit from 1920 to 1933, but Schlitz was ready. They changed their name to the Schlitz Beverage Company, changed their slogan to the drink that made Milwaukee famous, and started selling malt extract and non-alcoholic soft drinks called Schlitz Famo. They even launched a chocolate company called Eileen, that's Eulein, spelled phonetically, making milk chocolate with Wisconsin dairy. The chocolate venture failed because they couldn't compete with Hershey, but they survived. And the day Prohibition ended, they were ready to pour. By 1934, Schlitz was the top-selling brewery in the world. The war years only made them stronger. They shipped beer overseas to American troops. Soldiers came home with brand loyalty burned into their memories. By the late 1940s, Schlitz was the best-selling beer in America, finally overtaking Budweiser. Think about what that means. This is the era of Eisenhower, post-war prosperity. Television is new and beer companies are just learning how to advertise on it. Milwaukee is a thriving working-class city. If you watch Laverne and Shirley, set in the 1950s and 60s at a fictional Milwaukee brewery called Schatz, that's Schlitz, everyone knew it. They ran the iconic Go for the Gusto advertising campaign. They were trading the number one spot back and forth with Anheuser-Busch. The future looked limitless, but Schlitz wasn't alone at the top. They had a rival. Anheuser-Busch, based in St. Louis, Missouri, made a beer called Budweiser. Through the late 40s and 50s, these two giants were locked in a brutal war for the number one spot in American beer. They traded the top position back and forth like heavyweights exchanging punches. One year, Schlitz would be ahead. The next year, Budweiser would edge them out. The rivalry was fierce, and neither company could afford to blink. Then, on May 14th, 1953, Milwaukee blinked. Brewery workers walked off the job. It was a 76-day strike affecting 6 major Milwaukee breweries, including Schlitz, Pabst, and Blatz. The workers wanted wages comparable to what breweries on the East and West Coasts were paying. About a 25-cent per hour raise. Reasonable demand, terrible timing. Because here's what matters. Anheuser-Busch was in St. Louis. They weren't affected by the Milwaukee strike. And for 76 days, while Schlitz's factories sat silent, Budweiser was the only major beer still flowing. They captured shelf space. They captured bar taps. They captured customers. Every day the strike continued was another day that Bud drinkers forgot what Schlitz tasted like. Schlitz briefly regained the number one spot in 1954. But by 1957, they'd lost it permanently to Budweiser. The strike hadn't just cost them sales. It had cost them momentum. This is the first handicap, the first weight they strapped to their own. Legs in a race where their competitor was already running hard. And what did they do? They strapped on more. By 1967, the company was being run by Robert Eulein Jr., August Eulein's grandson. He was 51 years old, Harvard-educated, a polo player, 6'4", and he made a decision that would destroy the company. If he couldn't outsell Anheuser-Busch, he would outprofit them. The strategy was simple: cut costs, make the same beer for less money, pocket the difference. It sounds reasonable, right? That's what makes it so dangerous. Let me walk you through what Robert Eulein Jr. actually did. First, accelerated batch fermentation. Traditional lager needs time. Budweiser used 32 to 40 days of lagering. Schlitz cut their brewing and lagering time from 25 days to 21, then to 15. They called it accurate balanced fermentation to make it sound scientific. But what it really meant was green beer. Beer that was too young, beer that spoiled more quickly. Second, ingredient substitution. They started replacing some malted barley with cheaper corn syrup. They switched from fresh whole hops to hop pellets. They used cheaper extracts instead of traditional ingredients. Eulein believed that if he made the changes incrementally, no one would notice. Step by step, a little less malt here, a little more corn syrup there, and he was right. Sort of. The jump from A to B was tiny. The jump from B to C was tiny. But the jump from A to M, that was enormous. Customers started noticing something was wrong. They just couldn't put their finger on what. Third, because the beer was aged less, it developed a haze when refrigerated. So they added silica gel to prevent cloudiness. This worked, but it created a disclosure problem. If the FDA ever required ingredient labeling, Schlitz would have to admit what they were doing. Fourth, high-gravity brewing. They brewed stronger beer and diluted it with water later. More efficient, but risky for taste. Here's the thing. Real beer leaves beautiful patterns on the glass as you drink it. Little rings of foam that cling to the sides. Beer enthusiasts call this lacing. Good beer leaves intricate lace. Bad beer doesn't. There's a metaphor there, too. Think about the delicate, intricate web of factors that held Schlitz together at its peak. The careful brewing process, the trust of consumers, the family legacy, the Milwaukee identity. Like lace, it looked beautiful and complex, but it was fragile. Pull one thread and the whole thing starts to unravel. And they weren't just pulling one thread. They were attacking it with scissors. If you want to see how badly this could go, look at Hawaii. In 1964, Schlitz acquired Primo Brewery in Hawaii. By 1971, Primo had 70% of the Hawaiian beer market. 70%. Then Schlitz stopped full brewing in Hawaii. Instead, they shipped dehydrated wort from Los Angeles for fermentation on the islands. Hawaiian drinkers immediately noticed the taste change, and they hated it. By 1975, Primo's market share had collapsed from 70% to 20%. Schlitz learned absolutely nothing from this. By 1973, Schlitz was bragging about having the most efficient breweries in the world. They were expanding production capacity. Their profits-to-sales ratio was above industry average. Market share was growing faster than Anheuser-Busch or Miller. They built a brand new brewery in Baldwinsville, New York, specifically for continuous fermentation experiments. On paper, it looked like genius. In reality, it was a house of cards. And then 1976 happened. First, there was a growing fear that the FDA would require ingredient labeling on beer. This terrified Schlitz. If they had to disclose the silica gel they were using, while competitors who aged their beer naturally had nothing to hide, that would be a disaster. So they switched to a new anti-haze agent called Chill Guard. The beauty of Chill Guard was that it could be filtered out before bottling. Nothing to disclose. The problem? Chill Guard reacted with another additive they were using, a foam stabilizer called Calcaloid, and when those two chemicals combined, protein settled out of the beer. Visible, white, flaky. At best, customers saw tiny white flakes floating in their beer. At worst, it looked like mucus. Customers called it Snot. Just like cigarette companies knowingly degraded their product while hiding it from consumers, Schlitz secretly changed their formula hoping no one would notice. Both industries learned the same lesson. You can only lie to your customers for so long before they find out. And the 1970s context matters here. This is the era after cigarette advertising got banned from television in 1971. Beer companies like Schlitz were spending heavily on those exact same airwaves. Same tactics, same arrogance, same belief that marketing could cover up product problems. Schlitz kept quiet about the flakes for months. Robert Eilein Jr. argued that the haze was not physically harmful, which, technically true, but completely beside the point. Would you drink beer with snot floating in it? Eventually, they were forced to conduct a secret recall of 10 million bottles. Cost $1.4 million. In today's money, about $6.3 million. And then Robert Eilein Jr. died. He was diagnosed with leukemia in 1976 and died later that year. This was the first time leadership had transferred outside the Eilein family. And it left behind an inexperienced management triumvirate at the worst possible moment. The man who created the crisis never saw its full consequences. He died believing things could still be fixed. They couldn't. The market was already shifting. Miller Lite had launched and was becoming explosively popular. Schlitz responded with Schlitz Light in late 1976. James Coburn appeared in the commercials, but consumers were already suspicious of what Schlitz was putting in its beer. Schlitz Light failed in an otherwise expanding market sector. And then came the advertising disaster. Schlitz hired Leo Burnett and Company, one of Chicago's most respected ad agencies, to create a new television campaign. The concept: actors playing fierce Schlitz loyalists being threatened by an off-screen voice trying to get them to switch beers. There was a boxer, a lumberjack with a pet cougar, construction workers, an outdoorsman. In one ad, the lumberjack's cougar growls at someone trying to take his Schlitz. He says, "Down, baby, I can take care of this. You want to take away my Schlitz? You want to take away my gusto?" Another character threatened, "I'm going to play Picasso and put you on canvas." It was supposed to be funny. Tough guys defending their beer. Viewers found it terrifying. The advertising industry gave it a nickname, "Drink Schlitz or I'll kill you." The campaign was pulled after just 10 weeks. Leo Burnett was fired. The ads are now taught in marketing classes as an example of how not to advertise. Meanwhile, Bob Martin, Senior Vice President of Marketing, the power behind Robert Eilein Jr. since 1965, was running schemes that would eventually bring the FBI to Schlitz's door. First, the Houston Astrodome deal. Roy Hofheinz, the former Houston mayor who was building the world's first domed stadium, was short on cash. Martin advanced him $225,000 in Schlitz money. In exchange, exclusive rights to sell beer at the Astrodome. The deal was confirmed with a cryptic phone call. The baby has arrived and is doing nicely. Second, O'Hare Airport. In 1976, a Budweiser strike left the airport scrambling for beer. Schlitz swooped in from Milwaukee and used marketing allowances, questionable discounts, to lock in a deal. The SEC later accused Schlitz of $265,000 in false invoice cash payments. There were other deals too. $50,000 allegedly funneled to the president of restaurant chain Emerson's, $75,000 to secure sales priority at Wrigley Field, similar deals with the Texas Rangers Stadium, offers to fix bar floors in exchange for tap priority. Schlitz kept 2 sets of books to conceal these payments. The SEC estimated they were spending $3 million annually on these tactics, about $17 million in today's money. On March 15, 1978, a grand jury indicted Schlitz on 747 counts of illegal marketing practices, 3 felony counts, 1 misdemeanor, 743 misdemeanor violations of the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, Bob. Martin was fired. He later won a libel suit against the company. His aggressive tactics became legal evidence. The company tried to save itself. They brought in Frank Sellinger, a beer man from Anheuser-Busch, as CEO. Sellinger was the real deal, someone who actually understood brewing. He scrapped the disastrous processes, returned to old-school brewing methods, rebuilt the original, high-quality recipe. Technically, the beer was better, but trust was gone. The public had moved on. Look at the numbers. Sales peaked at 24.2 million barrels in 1976. By 1981, they had dropped to 6.2 million. Schlitz fell from number 2 to number 4, behind Miller and Pabst. Every cost-cutting measure Uihlein had implemented was a handicap. Every secret formula change was another weight strapped to their legs. By the time Frank Sellinger tried to run, the company could barely walk. On June 1st, 1981, approximately 700 production workers went on strike. Their contract had expired without replacement. The union claimed Schlitz was offering wages and benefits about half what Miller and Pabst paid. On July 31st, 1981, Schlitz announced that the Milwaukee plant would permanently close on September 30th. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was no longer being brewed in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Schlitz brewhouse stood unused until it was demolished in 2013. The historic complex was transformed into Schlitz Park, a mixed-use office development. If you work there today, you're sitting where they once brewed the most popular beer in America. Frank Sellinger had tried everything. Too little, too late. In 1982, Stroh Brewery Company of Detroit bought Schlitz for $500 million, beating out competing bids from Pabst and Heilemann. The acquisition made Stroh the 3rd largest brewing company in America. But Stroh took on massive debt to finance the deal, and the Schlitz brand was too toxic to revive. The company that bought Schlitz was killed by Schlitz. By 1999, Stroh sold all its assets to Pabst and Miller. And here's the saddest part. During the reformulating chaos of the early 1970s, the original Schlitz recipe was lost, not included in any subsequent sales of the company. For years, Schlitz existed as a cheap bargain brand beer, relegated to bottom shelves, until 2008. Pabst decided to resurrect the real Schlitz. They hired brewmaster Bob Newman, a 2-time brewmaster of the year. Newman dug through archives. He consulted old brew logs. He tracked down and interviewed retired Schlitz brewmasters and taste testers who remembered what the beer used to taste like in its golden era. Painstakingly, he reconstructed the classic 1960s formula. In 2008, they officially relaunched classic 1960s formula Schlitz. First markets: Chicago, Florida, Boston, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Milwaukee. They even hired 1968 Playboy Playmate Cynthia Myers as spokeswoman, matching the nostalgic theme. The response was strong, especially in the Midwest. Milwaukee stores couldn't keep it stocked. In 2009, Pabst symbolically shifted production back to Milwaukee. Today, the Schlitz brand is owned by Blue Ribbon Partners of San Antonio, an investment platform led by Eugene Kashper. In 2014, Kashper and TSG Consumer Partners purchased Pabst Brewing Company, including Schlitz, PBR, Old Milwaukee, and Colt 45. Schlitz still produces Schlitz malt liquor in some variations. It remains a sentimental favorite in the Midwest. The Uihlein family, by the way, is still prominent. Richard and Elizabeth Uihlein, descendants of the original brothers, are Lake Forest billionaires who founded packing supply giant Uihlein. The brewing legacy found a different outlet. But here's the question the restoration forces us to ask. Can a brand truly be restored once trust is broken? Is the restored Schlitz the same beer, or just a ghost wearing its old clothes? Bob Newman did everything right. He brought back the recipe. He brought back the taste. But he couldn't bring back 1965. He couldn't bring back the factory workers in Milwaukee, or the tap handles in Chicago, or the moment when ordering a Schlitz meant something. They bottled sunshine once. Actual vitamin D shined into beer by ultraviolet light. They were innovators. They were the biggest. They were the best. And then they decided that being profitable was more important than being good, that their customers wouldn't notice, that they could cut corners forever and marketing would cover the difference. The Schlitz mistake is now a business school case study in brand suicide, not because of one bad decision, but because of 100 small ones, each acceptable on its own, each invisible in isolation, each one another thread pulled from the lace. A company that once bottled sunshine eventually bottled something that looked like snot. And the only thing worse than making that mistake is believing you can get away with it. If you've ever had a Schlitz, or if you remember when Milwaukee was the beer city, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. And if you know another company that destroyed itself through 1,000 small cuts instead of one big blow, drop that too. Those are the stories I want to tell next. If this kind of thing interests you, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.